quick video to help you understand your progress in terms of imagining the importance of the Black founders. And I wanted to explain a little bit more about the core values and the Black founders we've looked at, as well as the reason that Sylvia Frey, Eddie Glaude, and James Cone's description of their significance in the United States is important to this class. So the first thing to show you here is the rubric from the Black Founders discussion. In the discussion, your goals were to talk to one another, meaning Rose did a great job as the first person and introducing herself and inviting conversation with the rest of you. And then I believe Labria chose Lemuel Haynes, and then everyone else chose Lemuel Haynes or didn't fully identify which founder they were talking about. So this is a tough assignment, but it's important because it will help you on the first paper. And I encourage you to go back and try to redo it and add more to it, or to think about these things as you do the assignment, the discussion assignment to begin with. First of all, I listed founders you could choose, but you could also choose others from the Sylvia Frey article if you want to, because there are not enough founders for everybody in the class if we only look at Merritt, Haynes, Hemmings, Wheatley, etc. So something that we're thinking about in this class is how the founders clearly articulate their core values. And the core values that we're talking about have to do with African American identity. And something that's important about those core values is the way they bring together freedom, equality, and faith. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. The next thing is understanding that some of these founders were enslaved and others weren't. For those who were not enslaved, such as John Merritt, the power dynamics when dealing with someone like George Whitefield or the Countess of Huntingdon, who were powerful white people, is obviously still going to be an issue. The next thing to think about is this is the period of the American Revolution, and we're starting with the American Revolution for an important reason, and that's because the state of South Carolina highly values founding documents and the study of our founders. Therefore, I believe that seeing the ways African Americans were present at the founding of the United States and the contributions those people made to the perfection of our union is really, really worthwhile. And finally, there's a term called positive Black identity, which means that African Americans were able to imagine themselves as actors, agents, children of God, you name it, in a variety of ways where their personhood didn't get circumscribed by slavery or by the racism that developed at the time of the American, or was developing at the time of the American Revolution. So each of these people, the founders we've looked at, know that they have a lot to contribute, and you want to try to imagine as much as you can about what they contributed and what their true beliefs and values were. So here is our class page, and this is our course documents folder. So you can open and close this core documents folder to see lots of important items, including the timeline and all of our readings and links to almost all of the videos that we will use. And I've also added a new document today that I will get to in just a second. The timeline, if you had difficulty seeing it as it was opened, you can open and scroll through from the course documents page. So these are the people I suggested you think about. Keep in mind that David the African was actually a British missionary. So he was Black, however, he was born in Britain. And he had to flee Charleston because he was preaching against slavery. Another important thing to consider at the time of the American Revolution and the time that David Margate, or David the African, arrived in Charleston, and that John Merritt was also present in Charleston. remember that South Carolina was the wealthiest colony of the 13 colonies. So think a little bit about that. Why was South Carolina the wealthiest colony? What was it about South Carolina, and particularly about Charleston, the main port city in South Carolina, that gave so much economic power to the state of South Carolina? Now, switching over to thinking a little bit more about our scholars, Sylvia Frey, Addie Glaude, and James Cone, there is a connection between those scholars talking about the founders and the founders that are people we discuss in the primary documents. So we've read the three scholars, and we are thinking about the core values of these people who combined the promises of the Declaration of Independence with what Sylvia Frey calls a diasporic consciousness. So you really have to synthesize these ideas for yourself, and I understand it's complicated. First of all, diasporic consciousness, which we get from Frey, means an awareness of who you are within a Black community and that is unified by a collective memory of a lost homeland. So it's understanding that you come from a different place, that you're not from Europe, that you're not a Native American, that you remember a place of freedom, which was Africa. Wheatley remembered it very well. Merritt did not remember it, but wanted to go back. David Margate was from England, but he identified as an African. So you have to ask, why was it so important for them to identify as Africans? What did they remember? What ideals and core values did they share? And how were those core values different from the European American revolutionaries? So one hint to describe that difference comes from Addie Glaude's work. Well, actually, the second hint comes from Addie Glaude. The first hint is the idea of diasporic consciousness, of remembering Africa as a place of freedom, different from Europe. Addie Glaude talks about how Black Christianity, despite slavery or racism or all of the things that were against our Black founders, gave people a sense of their worth before God and allowed them to self-determine, meaning that they made their choices and believed in who they were and didn't suffer from internalized racism or allow their situation to stop them from fighting for freedom. Well, whereas Black Christianity is about spiritual emancipation, that is the starting point for what Glaude calls Black collective action, or Black people working together. That if you know that you are a child of God, that we're all of one blood, then you can work together to realize that divine idea on earth. So I have a question here for you to think about. How did the core beliefs of Black Christianity and diasporic consciousness inspire Black people to interpret freedom and equality differently than someone like Thomas Jefferson? And how are these core beliefs that come from Black Christianity and diasporic consciousness really important to the United States as a nation, then and now? Glaude is very careful to tell us that there is an idea of Black nationalism, but that is not a belief that people are biologically similar because they're Black. The idea of race is not a scientific idea. So cultural nationalists do believe in common ancestry and culture, and that Black people have an affinity because Black people just all come together through some kind of esoteric, magical connection that unifies people just because they're Black, and that doesn't really define Blackness as anything other than something biological. Glaude takes issue with that. He says that the sense of peoplehood and the cultural identity that makes Black nationalism is made in a space made separate from other Americans by the actions of others. So this experience of being othered, of being placed in a space of not freedom, of enduring slavery and racism, give people a sense of peoplehood that is a rejection of racism. So, for example, in the Exodus story, the United States isn't the promised land. The United States is the place of bondage. Because in the United States, Black people are forced into a separate space where rights and equality couldn't exist. Black people rejected that premise that they belonged in a separate space and fought for freedom to break away from Egypt. Here is a little bit more about Black nationalism and the ways that it develops. But what Eddie Glaude wants us to remember is that Black nationalism is a problem-solving approach. And the main goal of Black nationalism is to seek to prevent the inhumanity of racism from affecting anyone else. It incorporates Black Christianity to protest the separateness of this space enforced by white supremacy. And Black nationalists constantly remind us that God made all nations of one blood. Then, in order to better understand the distinction we are seeking to describe or define, I read James Cone's lecture, Strange Fruit. It's about 25 minutes, but I stopped at the end so you can read the end and think about the ending yourself. But then I also rewrote the ending here to apply to what just happened this weekend. And I won't read this out loud to you. I will leave it to you to look at. However, I do hope that this description in this handout helps you put together what we're aiming to understand about the founders. Now, I'm going to slip back really quick to the syllabus, which I have revised, and I revised the agenda. Please remember on the very first page of the syllabus, the professor reserves the right to change the syllabus based on the particular needs of the class. So that has happened, and I have taken some things off the syllabus, and I have changed our agenda a little bit and updated it on Blackboard. So if you have any questions about that, please let me know, and I don't want the video to be too long. So have a great day.